Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The Forbidden Swing. The summer of 1869 held the Robinson estate in a verdant, opulent thrall. The air, thick with the mingling scents of 1,000 roses and the sweet, clean perfume of freshly mown grass, was a physical presence, a warm blanket under which society languidly perspired. It was a day for performance. The sharp crack of croquet mallets against wooden balls punctuated the polite murmur of conversations that flowed like shallow, sun-warmed streams, never daring to seek depth. Sunlight, dappled and diffused by the ancient oaks, scattered shifting patterns of gold upon the lawns, creating a scene of such curated perfection it felt almost unreal, a painter's dream of pastoral elegance. Yet, in a forgotten corner of the sprawling gardens, chaos gently reigned. An old, weathered swing, suspended from the thick bough of a gnarled oak, hung as a relic of a wilder time. Ivy, untamed and tenacious, crept up its ropes, and the ground beneath was a tapestry of moss and unruly wildflowers, a pocket of wilderness amidst the clipped precision of the estate. It was a place of secrets, a gilded cage with one corner left artfully rusted and overgrown. It was to this corner that Charles retreated. He moved through the garden party like a ghost, his thoughtful, poetic soul suffocating under the weight of expectation. His family, with their unyielding ambition, had decreed his future, a respectable, passionless career in law. The word itself, law, felt like a stone in his throat, a dull, heavy thing that would crush the life from his verses. He was a creature of shade and quiet contemplation, and the brilliant, brittle society gathered on the lawn felt like a violation. Each polite inquiry, each vapid pleasantry was a barb against his vulnerable spirit, a spirit that yearned not for wealth or status, but for a life of meaning, a life where the soul could breathe. He found the swing as if guided by an invisible thread of shared melancholy. It hung motionless, a silent testament to forgotten joys. He traced the grain of the weathered wood with a fingertip, a quiet communion with something that, like him, seemed out of place. He was not alone for long. Agnes Robinson, the middle daughter, found her way to the same secluded spot. Known for a wit as sharp as her intellect, she navigated the drawing rooms and garden parties with a composed grace that concealed a fiercely rebellious heart. She was a woman of profound thought in a world that valued only pretty phrases. The expectation that she would marry for status, a union of properties rather than souls, was a constant, simmering wound. Lord Ashworth, her father's choice, was a man whose title was his only interesting quality, and the thought of being tethered to his pompous vacuity felt like a sentence to a lifetime of intellectual starvation. She feared, with a terror that was almost physical, that her mind, her very spirit, would be locked away in the gilded cage of a conventional marriage. She saw Charles standing by the swing and paused, not wanting to intrude on his solitude, yet drawn to the quiet understanding she sensed in his posture. He looked up, his eyes, deep contemplative pools, meeting hers. "Forgive me," she said, her voice a low counterpoint to the distant laughter. "I seem to have stumbled upon your refuge." "It is a refuge for anyone who seeks it, I imagine," Charles replied, his voice softer than she had expected. "I was just admiring this swing. It feels as though it belongs to another time." Agnes moved closer, her sharp gaze taking in the scene, the swing, the man, the palpable sense of shared escape. "A freer, less complicated time," she murmured, almost to herself. Then, with a flicker of the wit that was her armour, she added, "For we were all required to give such convincing performances. The word performance hung in the air between them, a perfect gleaming pearl of understanding. It was a truth so profound, so deeply felt by them both, that it transcended the need for further explanation. In that single word, a current was established, an instantaneous recognition of kindred spirits trapped in the same elaborate play. Charles felt a loosening in his chest, a breath he did not know he had been holding. He had spent his life surrounded by people who spoke of weather and weddings, of politics and profits, yet here was a woman who spoke of the very essence of his own confinement. "I have often felt like an actor on a stage," he confessed, the words coming more easily than he could have imagined. "Speaking lines I have not written, playing a part I did not choose." "And the audience is so easily pleased," Agnes responded, a faint wry smile touching her lips. "As long as one bows at the right moments and never misses a cue, they applaud with great enthusiasm." Their eyes met again, and in that shared glance, a silent pact was made. The noise of the garden party faded into a distant hum, the world beyond their small ivy-draped sanctuary ceasing to exist. The air around the swing, already thick with the scent of roses and wild things, became charged with a new, unspoken longing. It was the thrill of discovery, the sudden sharp joy of finding an echo of one's own soul in another. But it was a joy tinged with the melancholy of their shared reality, the knowledge that this moment of connection was a stolen one, a brief interlude in a play that would soon demand their return to the stage. For now, however, they stood in the quiet wilderness of the forgotten corner, two prisoners who had, for a fleeting moment, found the key to each other's cage. Their first meeting at the swing was not an end, but a beginning. It became their secret cathedral, a place of quiet worship in the twilight hours, after the day's performances were done. By unspoken agreement, they would slip away from the drawing rooms, from the endless card games and stilted conversations, and find their way to the old oak. The world of propriety and expectation fell away the moment they entered the wild garden, leaving only the truth of their own hearts. Charles, who had never dared to share his verses with another soul, now found himself reading them aloud to Agnes. He would bring with him scandalous new books of poetry, works that defied the rigid sensibilities of their time, and in the deepening gloom, his voice would give life to words of passion and rebellion. Agnes, in turn, unlocked the secrets of her own mind. She brought her private journal, a small leather-bound book filled with astute, often cynical observations of their world. Her words were a mirror to his own thoughts, a sharp, clear reflection of the absurdities and injustices they both saw but were powerless to change. They talked for hours, their conversation stripping away the layers of polite society. He spoke of his dreams of leaving England, of finding a place where a man could be a poet without being a pariah. She confessed her terror of the impending betrothal to Lord Ashworth, a man who would value her dowry more than her mind. In the sanctuary of their shared secrets, they were not the dutiful son and the marriageable daughter, but simply Charles and Agnes, two souls yearning for freedom. One evening, a soft summer rain began to fall, whispering through the leaves of the great oak. They took shelter in a small abandoned gardener's folly nearby, a stone structure half swallowed by ivy. Huddled together in the dim, earthy-smelling space, the world outside blurred into a watercolour of grey and green. The scent of damp earth and rain had soaked stone filled the air, an intimate perfume that seemed to draw them closer. Agnes, her voice barely a whisper, confessed the true depth of her fear. "It is not simply that I do not love him," she said, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. "It is that he will extinguish whatever light I have within me. I will become another of his possessions, a pretty ornament for his drawing-room, my thoughts and opinions locked away like last season's gowns." In that moment of unguarded vulnerability, Charles felt a surge of protective tenderness. He saw not the witty, composed Miss Robinson, but a frightened girl, her spirit as fragile as a bird's wing. He in turn confessed his own deepest fear. "And I," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show, "I will become a man I do not recognize, a creature of contracts and courtrooms, my verses buried under a mountain of legal briefs. To leave England, it is not merely a dream, it is a necessity. It is the only way I can save myself." The rain subsided, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. A few nights later, under a sky strewn with stars, Agnes sat on the swing, the wood still cool and damp from the earlier shower. Charles stood behind her, his hands on the ropes. He gave a gentle push, and she soared into the night air, a silent, graceful arc against the darkness. His hands brushed her back with each push, a touch so light, so fleeting, it was almost imaginary, yet it sent a shiver through her. The rhythm was hypnotic, a slow, intimate dance in the moonlight. The only sounds were the soft creak of the ropes and the whisper of her skirts through the still air. As the swing slowed, he brought it to a halt, his hands resting on her shoulders, his face close to hers. The world fell away, leaving only the two of them in the moon-dappled shadows. The scent of her hair, a faint perfume of lavender and rain, filled his senses. He leaned in, his heart a wild, frantic bird in his chest, and gave her a soft, hesitant first kiss. It was a taste of freedom, a promise of a world beyond their gilded cages. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition, a tender affirmation of the unspoken truth that had grown between them in their secret meetings. When he drew back, the world rushed in with a startling clarity. For Agnes, it was as if she had been holding her breath her entire life and had only just exhaled. A profound stillness settled over her, a silence in which every sensation was magnified. She felt the slight tremble in his hands on her shoulders, the warmth of his breath against her cheek, the cool night air on her lips where his had been. This feeling, it was not the giddy foolishness she read about in novels. It was a deep, resonant chord of rightness, a sense of having arrived at a place she had not known she was seeking. The cynical armour she wore so expertly melted away, leaving her utterly, terrifyingly vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, a fragile bud of hope began to unfurl. Charles watched her, his own heart a tempest of fear and exultation. In the space of that single brief kiss, his abstract yearnings had found a tangible form. She was the poetry he had been trying to write, the meaning he had been searching for. He had feared he had overstepped, that he had shattered the delicate trust they had built. But as he looked into her wide, luminous eyes, he saw not reproach, but a reflection of his own dawning wonder. The future his father had mapped out for him, the life of law and loveless duty, seemed not just unpalatable, but impossible. He could not, would not walk that path now that he knew a single kiss could hold more truth than 1,000 legal texts. Neither spoke. The silence was not empty, but filled with the weight of their shared revelation. The air around the swing, once thick with unspoken longing, now hummed with a new, more potent energy. The creak of the ropes, the scent of her hair, the warmth of his hand on the small of her back as he finally helped her from the swing. Every small detail was now imbued with a sacred significance. Their inner conflict was no longer a battle between desire and fear, but a war between a world of impossible love and a world of unbearable loss. The idyllic twilight of their secret meetings was destined to be shattered by the harsh dawn of reality. The external pressures, which had always loomed like distant storm clouds, now moved in with a terrifying, inexorable speed. Agnes's parents, with the casual cruelty of the truly powerful, formally announced their intention to betroth her to Lord Ashworth. The union was praised in the drawing rooms of Hollingford as a perfect match, a brilliant alliance of status and wealth. The words, meant to be a chorus of celebration, sounded to Agnes like the tolling of a funeral bell. Simultaneously, Charles's gilded cage began to shrink. His father, a man whose will was as unbending as iron, presented him with a non-negotiable legal apprenticeship in London to begin at once. The dream of escape, of a life of art and meaning, was to be sacrificed on the altar of familial duty. Their separate prisons were about to snap shut. The locks turned, the keys thrown away. A seed of doubt planted by the cold reality of her situation began to grow in Agnes's heart. She saw the ruin that a rebellion would bring, not only upon herself, but upon Charles. A penniless poet and a disowned daughter. What future could they possibly have in a world that valued only position and property? Her love for him, which had been a source of strength, now became a source of fear. She could not bear the thought of being the architect of his destruction. Charles, meanwhile, was wrestling with his own demons. He saw Agnes in conversation with Lord Ashworth at a formal dinner, her face a mask of polite composure. He saw her smile, a faint, distant curve of her lips, and his heart twisted with a bitter, jealous pain. He did not see the terror in her eyes, the desperate plea for a rescue she knew he could not provide. He saw only a woman accepting her fate, a woman choosing the cold security of status over the uncertain passion of their forbidden love. Their final meeting at the swing was a study in misunderstanding. Agnes, feeling trapped and desperate, tried to explain her impossible position. She spoke of duty, of family, of the ruin that would befall them both. But her words, meant to convey the depth of her love and her fear, came out sounding pragmatic and resigned. "It is what is expected," she said, her voice devoid of its usual life. "There is no other way." Charles, his own heart raw with disappointment, heard not her fear, but her surrender. He did not confront her with the passionate despair that was consuming him, but with a cold, bitter disappointment that was far more cruel. "I see," he said, his voice a shard of ice. "You are just like everyone else, after all. I should have known." He did not wait for her reply, but turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the silent, motionless swing and the crushing weight of his misunderstanding. Heartbroken, believing that Charles had given up on them, that he saw her as a creature of convention rather than a woman in love, Agnes retreated into a cold, protective shell of propriety. She attended the endless rounds of social engagements, her face a perfect, unreadable mask. She accepted the congratulations on her betrothal with a grace that was as chilling as it was flawless. Inside, however, her heart was a barren, frozen landscape. Charles, feeling betrayed and utterly alone, prepared for his departure to London. He packed his books of poetry at the bottom of his trunk, burying them under a mountain of legal texts. He resigned himself to the dull, passionless future he had so desperately sought to avoid. The vibrant, sun-drenched gardens of the Robinson estate now felt like a prison, the scent of roses a cloying reminder of a love that was lost. The air, once charged with unspoken desire, was now heavy with an aching silence, the suffocating weight of words left unsaid. The swing, their secret sanctuary, hung motionless and empty, a forgotten relic in a forgotten corner of the garden, a silent testament to a dream that had died. The eve of her engagement announcement was a symphony of polite suffocation. The drawing room at the Robinson estate glittered with candlelight, the air thick with the scent of lilies and the murmur of self-congratulatory chatter. Agnes moved through the crowd like a phantom, her smile a brittle painted thing. Each compliment, each well-wishing remark, was a nail in the coffin of her happiness. She could not breathe. The walls, hung with silk and gilded mirrors, seemed to be closing in on her. With a sudden desperate clarity, she knew she could not bear another moment. Excusing herself with a murmured plea of a headache, she fled. She did not stop until she reached the wild, unkempt corner of the garden, the one place where she had ever felt free. The swing, her silent confidant, awaited her. She sank onto the weathered wood, the familiar creak of the ropes a mournful echo of her own broken heart. The tears she had held back for so long came at last, silent, scalding tracks in the moonlight. Charles had told himself he would leave without seeing her again. He had packed his trunks, arranged his travel, steeled his heart against the memory of her. But he could not go. He could not leave without one last lingering look at the place where his heart had, for a brief, brilliant moment, found its home. He was drawn to the swing by a force he could not name, a desperate, irrational hope he could not extinguish. He found her there, a small, solitary figure in the moonlight, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. In that instant, all pretense shattered. The carefully constructed walls of pride and bitterness crumbled, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their love. "Agnes," he said, his voice hoarse with an emotion he could no longer suppress. She looked up, her face pale and tear-streaked, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a desperate, fragile hope. He did not need to speak his heart. It was there in his eyes, in the raw anguish of his expression. He crossed the small space between them in 2 strides and fell to his knees before her, taking her cold hands in his. "I would rather live in poverty with you than in a palace without you," he whispered, the words a torrent of repressed longing and despair. "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool." "I thought you had given up on me," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I thought you believed I had chosen that." "I believed what my own broken heart told me to believe," he confessed, "and I have been living in a hell of my own making ever since. A life without you is no life at all," she whispered, her fingers tightening on his. "It is a slow, cold death." Their words, filled with months of unspoken pain, erupted into a passionate, desperate embrace. Pride and fear were burned away by the white-hot flame of their love. This was their turning point, their reckoning. To seize this one fragile chance at happiness, or to lose each other forever. He rose, pulling her to her feet. He led her away from the swing, deeper into the wild heart of the garden, to the old folly where they had once sheltered from the rain. The air was cool and damp, redolent with the scent of wet earth and overgrown ivy. Inside, the small stone structure was a haven of shadows, a secret world away from the prying eyes of the glittering house. There, on a bed of old burlap sacks that smelled of earth and time, he drew her down. The kiss that had begun in desperation by the swing now deepened into something else entirely, a slow, deliberate exploration, a silent language of reverence and need. Moonlight filtered through a high, grimy window painted them in strokes of silver and shadow. Every sound was magnified, the sigh of her breath, the frantic beat of his heart, the whisper of fabric against the rough floor. This was not a polite union. It was a sacred rebellion. A ribbon undone, a collar unfastened. Each was a barrier falling, a layer of the world they were leaving behind being stripped away. His hands, which had only known the pages of books, now learned the living poetry of her form, the curve of her waist, the delicate hollow of her neck, the silk of her skin beneath his trembling fingers. He worshipped her with his touch, a desperate and tender catechism. For Agnes, this was a profound surrender not to him, but to herself. The sharp-witted, guarded woman gave way to a creature of pure sensation. The heat of his skin against hers was a revelation, a warmth that thawed the ice that had encased her heart. She met his urgency with her own, her touch a fierce answer to his silent questions. It was a strange and holy communion, a mixture of raw sensuality and profound emotional catharsis. His mouth, which had spoken such bitter words, now whispered her name against her skin like a prayer. Her tears, once born of sorrow, were now tears of a joy so intense it was almost painful, a release of a lifetime of pent-up longing. The world outside, with its gilded cages and stifling expectations, ceased to exist. There was only this moment, this sanctuary. Their bodies, finally free, moved in a rhythm as old as the moon and tides, a dance of discovery and homecoming. It was a shattering of loneliness, a fusion of two souls who'd been wandering in the dark and had at last found their light in each other. In the quiet aftermath, they lay entangled in the shadows, their bodies still humming with the echo of their passion. His arm was a warm, heavy anchor across her waist. Her head rested in the hollow of his shoulder, her breath soft against his skin. They were no longer a boy and a girl dreaming of freedom. They were a man and a woman who had seized it. The world had not changed, the obstacles had not vanished, but they had. Their shared vulnerability had become their greatest strength. They knew now that true love was not an escape from the world, but the courage to build a new one, together. The fire of their reckoning had forged a new reality. In the cool pre-dawn light, still wrapped in the lingering scent of passion and damp earth, they made a pact. The world they had known, with its gilded cages and suffocating expectations, was a world they would leave behind. They would not be prisoners of circumstance, but architects of their own fate. Charles, with a small inheritance from a beloved grandmother, a sum he had guarded for a future he had never dared to imagine, secured passage on a ship to Italy. It was a leap into the unknown, a journey with no certain destination, but it was a journey they would take together. Under the cloak of darkness, Agnes packed a single bag. She left behind her jewels, her fine silk dresses, the tangible symbols of her gilded prison. She took with her only what was essential, a change of clothes, her journal, and the fierce, unwavering love that was now her only compass. They eloped, two fugitives from a world of comfortable misery, choosing a future of uncertainty and art over a lifetime of predictable, soul-crushing security. They sacrificed their families, their social standing, their very identities for something infinitely more precious, each other. Months later, the harsh English summer had been replaced by the sun-drenched, honeyed light of an Italian afternoon. Their home was a small, whitewashed villa overlooking the sea, its terracotta roof a warm splash of colour against the brilliant, impossible blue of the sky. The air was filled with the scent of lemons and salt, a perfume of freedom and new beginnings. Agnes sat by the open window, a sketchbook resting in her lap, her pencil moving with a graceful, confident ease. Charles sat beside her, a notebook open on the table before him, the ink flowing from his pen in a steady lyrical stream. There was no swing, but the warm breeze that stirred the muslin curtains was a gentle rhythmic push, a soft caress that whispered of the freedom they had found. He stopped writing and looked at her, his heart swelling with a love so profound it was almost painful. She was no longer the sharp-witted, rebellious girl he had met in the garden, but a woman in full glorious bloom, her spirit unburdened, her creativity unleashed. He reached for her hand, the one that was not holding the pencil, and brought it to his lips, kissing each knuckle with a tender reverence. "We are free," he whispered, the words a simple statement of a miraculous truth. She turned to him, her grey eyes, once so full of a shared melancholy, now shining with a fierce and tender love. She smiled, a slow, radiant curve of her lips that held all the joy of their new life. "We are home," she replied. Her embrace was not the desperate, clinging embrace of the folly, but a quiet celebration of a love that had been tested and had not been found wanting. It was a love that was both wild and everlasting, a passion that had found its sanctuary not in a secret corner of a garden, but in the wide, open, sun-drenched landscape of a shared future. They were no longer prisoners, but pioneers, building a new world, a new life, a new home, together. 2 bouquets. Nina's flower shop, Bloom & Bough, was not so much a place of business as it was a small, defiant jungle in the heart of Greenwich Village. Tucked into a side street where the city's roar softened to a hum, it was a jewel box of living things. The moment one crossed the threshold, the air changed. It grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp soil, the sharp green perfume of snapped stems, and above all the overwhelming velvet fragrance of roses. It was a chaotic symphony of colour. Delphiniums stood in cobalt blue columns beside the blushing coral of peonies. Ranunculus unfurled in shades of sunset orange and pale buttercup, and in the front window, like a sacred beating heart against the city's grey concrete, blazed the fiery crimson roses that had made her reputation. The shop was warm, personal, and a little wild. A perfect reflection of Nina herself. She had built it from the ground up, a sanctuary born from the ashes of relationships that had burned just as brightly and just as fast as her signature arrangements. Each one had been a grand, passionate declaration, a bonfire of exhilarating highs and gutting lows that had ultimately left her feeling scorched and empty. Her great secret wound was a creeping fear that she was a woman who could inspire only a wildfire, never the steady, life-giving warmth of a hearth. She could sell the dream of lasting love, bottle it in a vase with ferns and baby's breath, but she could not seem to cultivate it for herself. It was this lush, boisterous context that made the weekly order feel like a whisper in a crowded room, a note of stark minimalism in her maximalist world. For 3 months, it had appeared in her online system with the unassailable punctuality of a church bell. Every Friday morning, 7 a.m. on the dot, 12 long-stemmed white roses. No card, no message. The delivery address was a few blocks away. Nameless, faceless, a solemn, unchanging ritual. In the beginning it had been just another order. But as the weeks passed, Nina found herself imbuing the task with a strange reverence. While her other creations were explosions of joy, passion, and celebration, this one felt different. It felt like a prayer. She chose the 12 stems with meticulous care, selecting buds that were just on the cusp of opening, their petals furled tight as secrets. She stripped the thorns with a gentle hand and wrapped their long, elegant stems in simple brown paper, tying them with plain twine. The bouquet was a study in quietude, in graceful sorrow. It was everything her life was not, and it fascinated her. She had built 100 narratives in her head for the anonymous buyer. A grieving widower, a penitent lover, a child honouring a lost parent. Each story was tinged with a melancholy she found both beautiful and unsettling. One particular Friday the city wept. A cold, relentless rain fell from a bruised purple sky, slicking the streets and blurring the lights of passing cars into long watercolour streaks. The bell above her door had been silent for hours, the weather keeping even the most determined romantics at home. Her delivery courier, a cheerful kid named Leo, had called an hour ago. His bike chain snapped, his apologies profuse. Nina had been about to cancel the white rose order herself when the bell finally chimed. A soft, hesitant sound against the drumming of the rain. He filled the doorway, a tall, sombre man in a dark jacket that was beaded with rain. Water dripped from the ends of his dark hair onto the worn floorboards. He was gaunt, as if carved from something hard and unyielding, and he moved with a heavy stillness that seemed to absorb the shop's vibrant energy, quieting it. For a moment, he just stood there, his gaze sweeping over the riot of colour, a traveller washed up on the shore of a strange tropical land. "Can I help you?" Nina asked, her voice softer than she'd intended. He brought his eyes to her. They were the colour of a stormy sea, and in their depths she saw a profound, familiar sadness. It was a grief she recognised not in its particulars, but in its weight. It was the same hollowed-out look she'd seen in her own reflection after the last spectacular spectacular flame out of her heart. "I believe you have an order," he said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble like distant thunder. "The weekly one, white roses." Nina's breath caught in her throat. This was him, the ghost from her order queue, the silent patron of sorrow. He was nothing like the fragile old man she had sometimes pictured. He was formidable, grounded. The stillness she'd observed was not weakness, but a kind of tightly coiled control, an armour for a vulnerability she sensed was immense. "Yes, of course," she managed, turning to the cooler where the bouquet waited, a pale beacon in the dimming light. She brought it to the counter, the paper crinkling softly. "The courier had to cancel. I was just about to call." "I thought that might happen with the weather," he said, not quite meeting her eyes again. He pulled a worn leather wallet from his jacket. His hands were large, his fingers long and deft, but there was a faint tremor in them she might have missed if she hadn't been watching so intently. The air between them was suddenly charged with all the questions she had ever had. Who were they for? Why no card? Why this unwavering, silent devotion? But the questions felt like an intrusion, a clumsy trespass on sacred ground. So she said nothing, merely watched as he paid in cash, the crisp bills cool against her palm. He took the bouquet, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting, inconsequential moment that felt anything but. He held the flowers with a carefulness that spoke of their immense importance. "Thank you," he said, his gaze finally lifting to meet hers again. It was just for a second, but it was enough. Enough for her to see the landscape of loss he carried within him. Then he turned and was gone, the bell chiming his departure, the rain swallowing him back into the grey anonymity of the city. Nina stood for a long time, the scent of rain and roses filling the sudden, profound silence of her shop. The following Friday the rain had passed, leaving behind a city washed clean and bright. Nina found herself glancing at the clock all morning, a nervous flutter in her chest that felt ridiculously adolescent. She told herself it was simple curiosity, but it was more than that. The brief, silent encounter had left an impression, like a photograph developing slowly in the darkroom of her mind. She wanted to see him again. Just after 3 the bell chimed, and he was there. Ethan. He had told her his name the week before, a simple offering in the midst of their transaction. Today, he wore no jacket, just a soft grey Henley that stretched across his broad shoulders. He looked less like a ghost and more like a man, albeit one who wore his sorrow like a second skin. He began picking up the roses in person every Friday. Their conversations were at first as spare and elegant as the bouquets he bought. They spoke of the weather, of a new shipment of Dutch tulips, of the way the light changed in the shop as the afternoon wore on. Each exchange was a carefully placed stone building a tentative bridge across the chasm of their individual solitudes. He never explained the roses, and she never asked. It was an unspoken covenant, a respect for the sanctity of his ritual. One afternoon he arrived to find her perched precariously on a stool, swearing under her breath at her camera. She was trying to photograph a complex cascading arrangement of amaranth and gardenias for her website. But the light was flat, the angle was wrong, and the image on the small screen looked like a pale imitation of the vibrant reality before her. He watched her for a moment, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. "May I?" he asked, his voice gentle. Nina, flustered, nearly dropped the camera. "Be my guest. This thing and I are having creative differences." He took the camera from her, and in his hands the clumsy device became an extension of his own focused stillness. He didn't just look at the bouquet, he studied it, circling it slowly, his body moving with an unnerving grace. He adjusted a single leaf, tilted a blossom a fraction of an inch, and then, with an expert's eye, he moved to the other side of the room. The click of the shutter was a clean, decisive sound. He took only one shot. He handed the camera back to her. On the screen was her arrangement, but it was more than that. He had captured its soul, the play of shadow and light, the delicate droop of a petal, the confident spill of the greenery. It was all there, imbued with a depth and emotion she had failed to find. She breathed, genuinely stunned. "That's perfect. How did you do that?" "It's what I do," he said simply, a flicker of something, pride or perhaps just memory in his eyes. "I'm a photographer." That single frame opened a door between them. He began to linger on Fridays, arriving earlier, staying later. He would lean against the worn wooden counter, nursing a cup of tea she had made him, and watch her work. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a comforting weight, a quiet anchor in the floral chaos of her afternoons. Soon he was helping her close up, sweeping stray leaves from the floor, carrying the heavy buckets of water into the back room. One evening, long after the last customer had gone, with the shop bathed in the soft glow of a few strategically placed lamps, he finally spoke of the roses. They were surrounded by the scent of sleeping flowers, fragrance that was softer, greener than the heady perfume of the day. "There for a bench," he said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on a pale orchid in the corner. "In the park. There's a small plaque on it." He paused, and the silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the cooler. "For my partner. Her name was Sarah. She was a journalist. We were on assignment together." The confession was stark, unadorned, and for that reason devastatingly painful. Nina felt the shape of his loss, a vast empty space. In return, in that candlelit quiet, she offered him a piece of her own vulnerability. "I'm surrounded by all of this," she said, gesturing to the vibrant profusion around them, her voice barely a whisper. "I sell grand gestures, fiery, passionate, all-consuming love in the form of crimson roses." She looked down at her hands, her fingers stained with green. "But I'm terrified of it. I think that kind of love, the kind that burns so brightly, it always burns out. And I'm afraid that's the only kind I know how to inspire." They spoke for hours, of grief and passion as two different languages, one spoken in silences and memorials, the other in shouts and declarations. He saw the world in monochrome and shades of grey truth and hard-won light. She saw it in impossible, oversaturated colour. Later, as they stood by the door, he pulled out his phone. He hesitated, then swiped through a series of images. Nina braced herself for the stark reality of his work, but he scrolled past them. He stopped on one and turned the screen to her. It was not a photo of war or its aftermath. It was a field of wildflowers at dawn, somewhere impossibly green. The light was pale, ethereal, catching the dew on a million tiny petals. It was a moment of such unguarded, breathtaking beauty that it made her ache. "I took this the morning before," he trailed off, not needing to finish. It was a picture of the world as it had been, a world that still held the person he loved. As she leaned in to see the details, the soft focus on a single purple bloom, her hand resting on the counter, brushed against his. The contact was a spark, a sudden jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was a silent acknowledgement of the fragile, tenacious life stirring between them, a fragile bloom in the winter of his grief. He didn't pull away, neither did she. The air hummed, thick with the delicate friction between his contained sorrow and her vibrant, irrepressible life force. She found herself studying the lines of exhaustion and sorrow etched around his eyes, and was filled with an overwhelming, previously unimaginable urge to stay, to simply stand with him in the quiet, fragrant dark. The fragile peace they had cultivated in the quiet sanctuary of the shop was not destined to last. The world outside, with its noise and its demands, eventually came calling for Ethan. An old colleague, an editor at a prestigious photography journal, had been hounding him for months to submit his work from that final fatal assignment. It was a portfolio he had buried, both literally and figuratively, on a hard drive in the back of a closet. Finally, worn down by persistence and a small traitorous flicker of professional pride he thought had died with Sarah, he relented. He was nominated as a finalist for the prestigious Allard Prize. With the nomination came a sudden, unwelcome glare of attention. A major magazine wanted to run a feature story. A gallery in Chelsea planned an exhibit showcasing the work of all the finalists. Suddenly, the memories he had so carefully armoured himself against were being printed, framed, and lauded. The images were brutal, honest, a testament to his unflinching eye. They were filled with the noise of chaos, the grey dust of collapsed buildings, the stark, unbearable intimacy of death. He told Nina about the exhibit, his voice carefully neutral, as if discussing a distant acquaintance. He invited her to the opening, an invitation that felt more like a warning. She accepted, her heart a tangled knot of pride for his talent and a deep humming dread. She wanted to know all the parts of him, even the broken ones. She just hadn't understood how sharp those pieces would be. The gallery was a world away from Bloom and Bow. It was all white walls, polished concrete floors and hushed, reverent silence. The air was sterile, cold. Nina, in a simple dark blue dress, felt like an exotic bird that had strayed into a laboratory. She found Ethan's section at the far end of the main room and she stopped breathing. The man who had taken these photographs was a stranger. The gentle, quiet man who helped her sweep leaves and who could capture the soul of a flower was nowhere to be found in these frames. Here was the man who had stared into the abyss. A photo of a small child, face caked in dust, staring with ancient eyes from the rubble of her home. The twisted metal of a bombed-out market, a single bright red scarf snagged on a shard of steel. And the final largest piece, a portrait of a woman, laughing, her face alight with fierce intelligence and joy, a camera slung around her neck. Sarah. The caption beneath it was simple. Sarah Jenkins, near Holmes. It was the last photograph he ever took of her. The violence, the raw, unfiltered despair in the images struck Nina with physical force. It was a language of horror she could not comprehend. This was the ghost he was running from, and seeing it laid bare in stark black and white terrified her. A chasm opened up in her mind, wide and dark, between the man who arranged white roses on a memorial bench and the artist who had captured this unending scream of human suffering. A cold doubt, insidious and chilling, flooded her. Was his heart just a memorial bench, a space dedicated entirely to the past, with no room for new life to grow? Could her small, colourful world ever truly touch his? From across the crowded gallery, Ethan watched her. He had been dreading this moment, this collision of his two worlds. He saw the shock on her face, the way the colour drained from her cheeks. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes as she looked from the photos to him and back again. And in that moment, his deepest, most guarded insecurity was confirmed. His trauma was a contagion. His darkness was a poison that would inevitably extinguish her light. He was toxic. He saw her turn and walk away, swallowed by the crowd without a backward glance. The polite applause for some speech being made on the far side of the room sounded like the roar of an inferno. The next Friday, the 7 a.m. order for 12 white roses did not come. The silence in her inbox was a definitive damning judgment. Nina waited all day, her hope dwindling with the fading afternoon light. He didn't come. She sent a hesitant text. "Are you okay?" It remained unread. Days turned into a week. Ethan had disappeared. He retreated into the silent grey emptiness of his apartment, the polar opposite of her shop. He was convinced that his withdrawal was an act of kindness, a painful but necessary amputation to protect her from the gangrene of his past. He had allowed himself a brief, beautiful respite in her world of life and colour, but he didn't belong there. He was a creature of shadow, and he had no right to stand in her sun. Nina, meanwhile, misinterpreted his silence completely. To her, it was proof that their connection had been nothing more than a temporary solace for him, a brief stop on his journey of grief, another beautiful thing destined to wilt and die. It confirmed her own deepest fear that she was only a fleeting passion, a momentary distraction, never the destination. Surrounded by the bold, screaming red of her signature roses, she felt utterly, hopelessly colourless. She had been a fool to believe that love could be a quiet thing. Love, for her, was always loud, and its silence was always the sound of it ending. The night of the Allard Prize ceremony arrived on a wave of frigid November air. Nina knew Ethan was expected to win. The critics had all but declared it. The thought of him standing on a stage celebrated for the very horror that had driven them apart was a bitter pill. For days she had moved through her shop like a phantom, the vibrant colours and scents a mocking reminder of the grey hollowness inside her. But as the evening approached, a familiar, defiant spark began to smouldering within her. It was the same fire that had allowed her to build a life from ashes before. She would not let him disappear into his ghosts. She would not let their story end in a silent, misunderstood retreat. With trembling, determined hands, she began to work. She selected a single perfect red rose. Its petals were the colour of deep arterial blood, velvety and just beginning to unfurl. She placed it in a simple, elegant black vase, its solitary beauty a stark, powerful statement. It was the kind of arrangement she was famous for, the kind that spoke of grand, unequivocal passion. She wrote a simple note on a thick cream card. The red rose whispers of passion. She left the rest of the line unwritten, a question hanging in the air. She called a courier and had it delivered to his table at the awards dinner. It was a final, desperate plea, a reminder of her language, of the world he had briefly inhabited. Ethan saw the rose the moment he sat down. It was an impossible splash of colour in the sea of black tuxedos and glittering gowns. It was Nina. It was her fire, her challenge, her life force, delivered to the heart of his monochrome world. He read the card, the unfinished line a brand on his conscience. He spent the entire ceremony in a haze, the speeches and applause a distant roar. When his name was called as the winner, he moved towards the stage like a man in a dream. He accepted the heavy glass award, his hand closing around its cold, sharp edges. He looked out at the sea of expectant faces, cleared his throat, and spoke into the microphone. "Thank you," he said, his voice clipped and raw. There is no honour in photographing suffering. There is only a duty to witness it. A duty I failed." Before the stunned silence could break, he placed the award on the podium, turned, and walked off the stage. He found her waiting outside, huddled in her coat against the biting wind, her breath pluming in the cold night air. The city lights glittered around them, hard and indifferent. For a long moment they just stared at each other, the space between them humming with everything left unsaid. He spoke first, his voice ragged. "You shouldn't have come." "You didn't give me a choice," she countered, her own voice tight with unshed tears. "You just disappeared. You let me believe I was protecting you," he broke in, his control finally shattering. "Did you see those photos, Nina? Did you see what that world is? It breaks everything and it touches. It broke me. I'm a landscape of ghosts and ruins. I can't drag you into that. I won't let my darkness put out your light." Her anger flared, fierce and righteous. "My light is not that fragile," she cried, taking a step closer, invading his space. "And your darkness isn't who you are. It's what happened to you. I see your wounds, Ethan. I'm not afraid of them. But I am afraid of this silence. I don't want your ghosts or your self-imposed penance. I want you, the man who knows how to capture the soul of a flower, the man who makes me tea and helps me sweep the floor, the man who stood with me in the dark." Her voice broke on the last word. "I am falling in love with you." and you are trying to edit me out of your story like a bad photograph." His face crumpled, the carefully constructed walls of his composure turning to dust. "I don't know how," he whispered, a confession of utter defeat. "I don't know how to be that man for you." "Then let me show you." She closed the final distance between them, rising on her toes to meet his lips. Their first kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, hungry collision on a cold New York street. It was a storm of grief and hope, anger and longing. It tasted of salt and cold air and the profound, aching relief of a dam breaking. His arms came around her, pulling her tight against him, a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. The fire she had always craved, the grand passion she equated with love, was finally here. But it wasn't the frivolous, fleeting blaze she had known before. This was different. It was a purifying flame born of shared pain and a terrifying, beautiful acceptance. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against hers, their breath mingling in the frozen air. "Come home with me," he said, the words both a plea and a promise. He took her back to his apartment. As the door swung open, she saw it as she had imagined it, minimalist grey, a space devoid of colour. But for the first time, she didn't see it as empty. She saw it as a canvas, a space waiting for life. Their intimacy was a transcendent act of healing. There was no hurry, no frantic grasping. It was a slow, deliberate, reverent exploration, a mapping of scars, both visible and invisible. In the low light of his bedroom, he undressed her with hands that trembled slightly, his photographer's eyes tracing the lines of her body as if committing them to memory. She, in turn, met his vulnerability with a fierce tenderness, her fingers tracing the tense line of his shoulders, the faint, silvery scars on his back. She kissed each one, a silent vow to love the history written on his skin. This was a surrendering. He, a man who had made his name by seeing, finally allowed himself to be truly seen, his brokenness laid bare, and she, a woman who feared the silence, learned its language. Their bodies spoke what words could not, the slide of skin against skin, the whisper of a name against a throat, the rhythm of their breathing falling into a shared cadence. It was a sensual and deeply vulnerable communion, a physical manifestation of her bringing colour into his grey world and in bringing a profound, steadying depth into hers. He drew her near, their bodies meeting softly with a slow, sacred rhythm. He watched her face, saw the acceptance, the desire, the unwavering love in her eyes, and felt something inside him knit together. It was a reverence for the flesh, a hallowed connection, the body as the soul's most honest expression. In her arms, with her name a prayer on his lips, Ethan realised that love wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing the scars. It was about finding the one person willing to hold the light for you while you navigated the darkness. It was about letting them help you carry the weight. And as Nina held him, feeling the solid, living warmth of him, she understood that the most powerful passion wasn't a sudden blaze that consumes everything in its path, but the unwavering, constant flame that stays lit in the darkest of rooms. In the aftermath, in the quiet of the dawn filtering through the large, bare windows of Ethan's apartment, a new kind of peace settled between them. The world outside remained, with all its demands and its ghosts, but its power over him felt diminished, held at bay by the simple, profound reality of Nina's presence beside him. A week later, he was offered a lucrative, high-profile assignment to document post-conflict rebuilding in Eastern Europe. The old Ethan would have taken it in a heartbeat, seeking the familiar solace of the road, the anaesthetic of the camera lens. This Ethan, the man who had been resurrected in a flower shop, turned it down without a moment's hesitation. He chose to stay. He chose her. Instead, he began a new project, a personal one. He titled it Bloom and Bow, It was a photo series dedicated to capturing the secret, vibrant life of the city that Nina had shown him, the beauty that flourished in the cracks of the concrete. He photographed the early morning light hitting the buckets of flowers outside her shop, the gnarled hands of a woman tending her window box in the West Village, the riot of colour in a community garden in the Bronx. His work found a new voice, a new depth. The stark honesty was still there, but it was now balanced with the tenderness, a reverence for life's stubborn, fragile beauty. The shadow was still present, but now it served only to accentuate the light. Nina's work began to change too. Her arrangements, once defined by their bold, passionate declarations of red, grew more complex, more nuanced. She started incorporating more variety, more subtlety. She wove in the soft blues of forget-me-nots, the gentle lavender of lilac, and even, to her own surprise, the delicate, hopeful presence of pure white roses. Her art was no longer just about the fire. It was about the entire garden, the quiet growth as much as the full, spectacular bloom. Weeks later, on a crisp Friday morning, the bell above her door chimed. Ethan walked in, the early sun catching the silver in his dark hair. He wasn't there for his usual order. His hands were empty, save for his ever-present camera slung over his shoulder. He watched her for a moment, a slow, easy smile spreading across his face, a smile that reached the depths of his storm-grey eyes and calmed the seas. "I have something for you," he said. He hadn't brought flowers, he had come to make them. He moved behind her counter with a newfound familiarity, his quiet confidence a comforting presence in her space. He went to her buckets, the ones filled with the day's freshest offerings, and began to choose stems. His selections were deliberate, his movements as precise and artful as when he held his camera. Nina watched, her heart swelling as he built a bouquet. When he was finished, he turned and presented it to her. It was breathtaking. At its very centre stood a single perfect red rose, its petals a rich, deep crimson. But surrounding it, supporting it, was a soft, cloud-like embrace of a dozen long-stemmed white roses, their pristine petals just beginning to open. It was their two languages, their two worlds, woven together into a single harmonious whole. Tucked into the twine was a small cream card, the same kind she had sent to him. On it, in his strong, clean handwriting, was the rest of the line. "And the white rose breathes of love." He had learned to speak both languages. Nina looked up from the impossible perfect bouquet, her eyes shimmering with tears she didn't bother to hide. And he was there, his camera raised, not to document sorrow or capture a fleeting moment of beauty, but to capture her, his forever subject. The woman who was both the fire and the hearth, bathed in the golden morning light of the world they had built together. The shutter clicked, a clean, decisive sound, the sound of a new beginning. Midnight Confessions. The party was a sensory assault, a maelstrom of freshman freedom that hit Emma with the force of a physical blow. The air thick and sweet with the cloying scent of cheap beer, perfume and the effervescent tang of possibility vibrated with a bass line that seemed to pulse in her very bones. Neon and string lights, a modern echo of an Austin ballroom's candlelight, cast shifting, intimate shadows on the writhing mass of bodies that filled the cramped apartment. It was a chaotic tapestry of youth and abandon, a place where a single moment of connection could feel like discovering a pocket of perfect, profound silence in the heart of a storm. Emma stood at the edge of the chaos, a solitary island in a sea of revelry, nursing a plastic cup of something vaguely alcoholic. Her vulnerability was a quiet, aching loneliness, a familiar companion born from years of unrequited love for her best friend, Jake. He was across the room, a radiant sun in his own solar system of admirers, his laughter a bright, melodic counterpoint to the thumping music. He moved with an easy, unthinking confidence, a charm that seemed as natural to him as breathing. He was at home in the crowd in a way Emma never could be. His emotional wound was a deep-seated fear of change, a quiet terror of the shifting sands of life beyond their shared history. Their friendship was his anchor, a steady point in a world that threatened to pull him in 1,000 different directions. He was blissfully, painfully oblivious that he was the source of her quiet agony. She watched him now, a familiar pang of longing twisting in her gut as he threw his head back in laughter, his arms slung casually around the shoulders of a girl whose name Emma didn't know and didn't want to know. It was a scene she'd witnessed 1,000 times, in a dozen different settings, a constant, painful reminder that she was on the outside of his romantic world, a permanent fixture in the landscape of his life, but never the focus of his gaze. Fueled by a potent mix of cheap vodka and the heady, intoxicating promise of college, a place for reinvention, a chance to shed the skin of her high school self and emerge as someone new, someone bold, she felt a reckless surge of courage. It was a desperate, electrifying impulse, a voice in the back of her mind whispering, "Why not now? Why not you?" She set her cup down on a cluttered bookshelf, the plastic sticking for a moment to a ring of condensation. Then, with a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic fluttering in her chest, she began to walk. The crowd parted before her, a sea of faces turning and then turning away, oblivious to the momentous journey she was undertaking. She moved with a singular purpose, her eyes fixed on Jake, a magnetic pull drawing her toward him. He saw her then, his easy smile faltering for a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to greet her with the casual, familiar warmth that was so much a part of their friendship, but she gave him no time. She reached him, her hand closing around his wrist, her touch a silent, urgent command. "Emma? What's up?" he asked, his voice a bewildered murmur against the thumping bass. She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled him, her grip surprisingly strong, her determination a force he couldn't resist. She led him away from the pulsing heart of the party, away from the laughter and the music and the swirling lights, into the relative quiet of the narrow hallway that led to the bedrooms. The air here was cooler, the music a muffled heartbeat against the thin walls. He was still looking at her, a question in his eyes, a half smile playing on his lips, when she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was an impulsive, clumsy, desperate act, a collision of lips and teeth and pent-up emotion. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic drumbeat that echoed the music of the party. His lips were warm, surprised, and for a breathtaking, electrifying moment they responded. It was a kiss that shattered the careful, fragile equilibrium of their friendship, a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. And in the sudden, terrifying thrill of that moment, with the scent of beer and cheap perfume and possibility filling the air around them, Emma felt a dizzying, terrifying hope bloom in the desolate landscape of her heart. The world, for a single breathless instant, seemed to hold its breath, and in the silence she heard the frantic, hopeful beating of her own heart, a sound that was both a prayer and a lament. The kiss, a clumsy, impulsive collision of longing and liquid courage, hung in the air between them, a fragile, shimmering thing that threatened to shatter at the slightest touch. In the immediate aftermath they retreated to the familiar, well-worn paths of their friendship, seeking refuge in the safety of old routines. Late-night study sessions in the hushed, cavernous expanse of the university library, its towering shelves of books, silent witnesses to their shared history, and movie marathons in the cosy, cramped confines of Jake's dorm room, became their sanctuary. But the sanctuary was no longer a place of perfect, uncomplicated peace. A new, unspoken tension had taken root, a delicate, almost painful awareness that had not existed before. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the ghost of a kiss that lingered on their lips. The change was subtle at first, a series of small, almost imperceptible shifts in the landscape of their friendship. During a cram session for midterms, Jake found himself distracted not by the dense, impenetrable text of his political science textbook, but by the way the warm, golden light of the desk lamp caught in the soft brown strands of Emma's hair, turning them to threads of spun gold. He watched, mesmerised, as she chewed on the end of her pen, a small, thoughtful frown creasing her brow, and felt a sudden, unfamiliar ache in his chest. A yearning he couldn't name. Later, curled up on his bed, the flickering light of the television casting long dancing shadows on the walls, he became acutely, almost painfully aware of the warmth of her thigh pressed against his. It was a casual, unconscious touch, a proximity they had shared 1,000 times before, but now it felt different, charged with a new, unspoken significance. He could feel the heat of her skin through the thin fabric of her jeans, a warmth that seemed to seep into him, a slow, spreading fire that left him breathless and confused. They began to talk, not about the movie or their classes or the latest campus gossip, but about their real, unspoken fears. The fear of failing a class, of disappointing their parents, of not knowing who they were supposed to be in this new, overwhelming world of college. It was a deeper, more profound vulnerability than they had ever shared before, a stripping away of the carefully constructed facades they presented to the world and to each other. He confessed his fear of the future, of the vast, unknowable expanse of life that stretched before him, a terrifying, uncharted territory that he was afraid to navigate alone. She, in turn, spoke of her own insecurities, of the gnawing, persistent feeling that she was not enough, that she was destined to be a supporting character in her own life, a spectator rather than a participant. The awkwardness of the kiss began to melt away, replaced by a tentative, fragile new dynamic. A casual touch became a lingering caress as he brushed her hand, his fingers tracing the delicate lines of her palm. He started walking her back to her dorm every night, their goodbyes growing longer and quieter, the space between them filled with a silent, unspoken longing. One night, under the dim, watery light of a campus streetlight, he leaned in, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher, his lips just inches from hers. She held her breath, her heart a frantic, fluttering bird in her chest. But at the last second he pulled back, his inner conflict a palpable thing in the cool night air. The sensual tension between them was a constant simmering presence, a live wire that hummed with a dangerous unspoken energy. Every shared textbook, every accidental touch, every quiet moment in the close, intimate confines of their dorm rooms became a source of simmering desire and restraint. He was fighting his own surprising, overwhelming longing, a feeling that was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. And she, in turn, was aching for him to finally see her, to see the woman she was becoming, the woman who had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. The burgeoning intimacy between them, the fragile, beautiful thing that had begun to bloom in the wake of their kiss, was a territory Jake was not yet brave enough to explore. Panicked by the depth of his own feelings, by the terrifying, exhilarating pull he felt toward Emma, he made a desperate, clumsy move to restore the old familiar status quo. He was a man adrift in a sea of change, and their friendship had always been his anchor, the one constant in a world that was constantly in flux. The thought of losing it, of risking the one thing that had always been a certainty in his life, was a fear that was greater than any other. And so, in a moment of cowardice that he would later come to regret with a bitterness that was as sharp as a physical pain, he began to casually date a girl from his chemistry class. Her name was Sarah, and she was pretty and smart and funny, but she was not Emma. She was a buffer, a public and painful declaration of his intention to remain firmly in the friend zone, a shield against the overwhelming, terrifying force of his own heart. The external conflict was this new, unsuspecting girl. The internal conflict was Jake's own cowardice, his fear of the unknown, his desperate, misguided attempt to outrun his own heart. Emma saw them together at the student union, their heads bent close together over a shared textbook, their laughter a bright, careless sound that seemed to mock her own secret, fragile hope. They were holding hands, their fingers intertwined in a casual, intimate gesture that was like a physical blow to her heart. The sight of it, the easy, uncomplicated intimacy of it, was a definitive, unspoken answer to her impulsive, desperate kiss. She had been rejected, not with words, but with a casual, public display of affection for another woman. The humiliation of it was a cold, bitter pill to swallow. She had not only been rejected, she had made a fool of herself, had risked their friendship, their long, beautiful, complicated history, for a moment of reckless, impulsive hope, and she had lost. She retreated, a wounded animal seeking the safety of her den. The late-night study sessions ceased. The movie marathons came to an end. Her texts went unanswered. Her calls went to voicemail. The silence between them was a vast, empty chasm, a void that was filled with the ghosts of unspoken words and unfulfilled desires. Emma threw herself into her studies, her loneliness a cold, hollow ache in her chest. She felt utterly exposed, naive, a fool for having believed, for even a moment, that a single kiss could change the course of their lives. She built a wall around her heart, a fortress of books and lecture notes and late-night study sessions in the library, a place that was once a sanctuary, but was now a constant, painful reminder of what she had lost. Jake, meanwhile, found that his return to normal was anything but. The easy, uncomplicated relationship he had sought with Sarah felt empty, a pale imitation of the deep, meaningful connection he had shared with Emma. The absence of her late-night texts, her easy laughter, her quiet, steady presence in his life left a void that was far larger and more painful than he could have ever imagined. The friendship he had been so desperate to save was already dead, and he was the one who had killed it. The silence on the other end of the phone was a deafening roar, a constant, painful reminder of his own cowardice, his own foolish, misguided attempt to outrun the one thing that had ever truly mattered. The tone between them was stormy, aching, and silent. The air was heavy with regret, with the suffocating weight of unspoken desires and unfulfilled promises. The line had been crossed, the fragile, beautiful thing they had shared was broken, and they were both left to navigate the wreckage of their own making, alone in the silence. The evening air was heavy and still, thick with the scent of damp earth and the unspoken tension that had been building for weeks. A low, oppressive blanket of clouds had swallowed the last of the daylight, plunging the campus into an early twilight. Emma was walking across the quad, the silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic, when she saw him. Jake, a solitary figure under the weak glow of a lamppost, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of misery that was a perfect mirror of her own. The sight of him, so utterly, completely wretched, was the spark that ignited the tinderbox of her own pain and frustration. All the hurt, all the anger, all the unspoken words that had been churning inside her boiled over. She changed course, her steps quickening on the flagstone path, a warrior marching into a battle she could no longer avoid. She confronted him, her voice breaking but strong, the words tumbling out in a torrent of pain and anger. Was I just a placeholder, Jake? Someone to kill time with until someone better came along? I need to know. Am I just your buddy, or am I the love of your life? Because I can't live in the middle anymore. Her ultimatum, raw and desperate and stripped of all pretense, shattered his carefully constructed defences. He finally looked at her, his eyes dark with a pain that was as real and as visceral as her own. He confessed the truth, his voice raw and ragged in the heavy air. He spoke of his fear, of his stupidity, of his terrifying, heart-stopping realization that his life was meaningless without her in it. "The whole time I was with her," he said, his voice a ragged whisper, "all I could think about was you. It's always been you, Em. I was just too scared to see it." The raw, desperate honesty of their confessions, the stripping away of all the layers of fear and uncertainty and doubt broke the dam of their restraint. He pulled her into his arms, and their kiss was no longer impulsive or tentative, but deep and claiming, a fusion of tears and years of pent-up emotion. It was a kiss that spoke of homecoming, of a love that had been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged. The need to be alone, to be away from the prying eyes of the campus, was a palpable, urgent thing. He led her back to his room, their hands clasped tightly, their bodies trembling with an emotion that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, the confrontation melted into a night of fierce, vulnerable, and transcendent intimacy. It began with their clothes, shed in a desperate and fumbling haste, a shedding of old identities, best friend, buddy, placeholder, until they stood before each other, raw and new. His hands, no longer hesitant, explored the familiar territory of her body with a reverence that was almost holy, but it was a reverence charged with years of suppressed hunger. He touched her, as if she were a precious, fragile thing he had only just discovered, his fingers tracing the lines of her face, her neck, her shoulders, as if memorizing a sacred text. His lips followed, blazing a slow, deliberate trail of fire that left her shivering in his arms. He kissed her with a hunger that was both fierce and tender, lingering over her lips before drifting to her ear. His breath was warm as he whispered words meant only for her, sweet nothings that made her laugh softly, the sound breaking into a breathless squirm when his teeth caught playfully at her earlobe. His mouth wandered lower, tracing the delicate line of her neck with kisses that carried both reverence and want, leaving a heated path that made her pulse race beneath his lips. She arched toward him, her body alive to every touch, every pause. When his mouth reached her chest, he didn't rush. He took his time, lavishing attention, as though each peak of desire was a discovery worth worshipping. Her soft cries filled the room, a mixture of delight and longing, her hands threading through his hair to keep him close. Still lower he moved. A trail of kisses spilled across her ribs, her stomach, her trembling skin. He lingered at her belly button, teasing, drawing from her another breathless laugh that dissolved into a sigh. And then, slowly, deliberately, he continued further down, every touch an unspoken vow, every kiss growing hotter, more demanding. He knelt before her, his gaze intense, a silent question she answered with a trembling nod, and then he brought her to the heart of her most intimate place, his mouth a source of exquisite, unbearable pleasure. It was a revelation, a complete and total surrender. Emma, who had spent years hiding her desire, felt it bloom under his touch, a wild, untamable thing. Her fingers tangled in his hair, her hips arching, as if drawn by a magnetic pull she could no longer resist. The world narrowed to this single searing point of contact, a symphony of sensation that built and built until it shattered her into 1,000 pieces. Her release a raw, keening cry. Echoed in the quiet room. Before the aftershocks had even faded, he was rising, lifting her into his arms and carrying her to the bed. He came to her then, his body covering hers, and the years of unspoken longing, of quiet, secret desire, were unleashed in the powerful, primal rhythm of their intimate communion. It was a dance of two souls, a frantic, desperate claiming. They moved as one, a fusion of longing and devotion, his eyes locked on hers, and in their depths, she saw not just desire, but a profound, soul-deep recognition. This was not just sharing of intimacy, it was a consecration, a physical manifestation of a love that had finally found its voice. Their climax was a shared, shuddering crest, a wave of pure sensation that washed away all the pain and misunderstanding, leaving only the raw, beautiful truth of their connection. Emma, who had always felt that her vulnerability was a weakness, a flaw to be hidden away, learned that it was, in fact, her greatest power. It was her vulnerability that had allowed her to love him so completely, so unconditionally, and it was her vulnerability that had finally broken through his own walls of fear and doubt. Jake, in turn, understood that true love wasn't the absence of risk, but the courage to risk everything for it. He had been so afraid of losing her that he had almost lost her for good. And in that moment, in the quiet, intimate aftermath of their passion, he knew that he would never make that mistake again. They woke to the quiet hum of the world coming to life. There was no thunder, no dramatic reveal, only the soft grey light of dawn filtering through the blinds of Jake's dorm room, painting stripes across the tangled sheets and their sleeping forms. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth, a clean, fresh scent that felt like a new beginning. Emma stirred first, her senses slowly coming online, the comforting weight of Jake's arm draped across her waist, the steady rhythm of his breathing against her back, the unfamiliar texture of his pillow beneath her cheek. The awkwardness she had anticipated, the morning after anxiety that was a staple of movies and cautionary tales, was simply not there. In its place was a profound, almost startling sense of peace, a feeling of rightness that settled deep in her bones. She lay still, not wanting to break the spell, watching the dust motes dance in the slanted bars of light. He woke slowly, his breath catching for a moment before he pulled her closer, his lips finding the curve of her shoulder. "Hey," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Hey," she whispered back, a smile in her voice. Their friendship, the thing that had been the bedrock of their lives for so long, was not lost. It had been transformed, a sturdy, unshakable foundation upon which they could now build their love. They rediscovered each other in the quiet hours of that morning, not as best friends but as partners, their shared history a rich, fertile ground from which their new love could grow. They talked in low voices, their words weaving a new tapestry of shared dreams and whispered confessions, the conversation as easy and natural as breathing. A week later they found themselves at another party, a loud, crowded affair that was a mirror image of the one where their story had begun. But this time everything was different. This time Jake never left her side. His hand was a constant warm presence in hers, his fingers intertwined with hers in a silent public declaration of their new, shared reality. He drew her closer, until the rest of the world was just a muffled roar around them, and his lips found the shell of her ear. "I spent so long looking past you," he murmured, his voice thick with the weight of his regret and the depth of his love. "Never again. You're the centre of my world now." He then turned her face to his and kissed her, a soft, possessive kiss that was both a beginning and an end, the end of their old story and the beginning of their true one. It was a quiet vow made in the heart of the noise, sealing their future. The world around them, with its laughter and its swirling chaotic energy, faded into the background. In that moment, there was only the two of them, a solitary island in a sea of revelry, a pocket of perfect, profound silence in the heart of the storm. And in that silence Emma heard the steady, triumphant beating of her own heart, a sound that was no longer a lament, but a song of a love that had finally, beautifully bloomed. The Orchard Heir. The air in Bishop's Orchard, as it was still called in the waning months of 1880, was thick with the ghosts of sweetness. Autumn had laid its heavy honeyed hand upon the land, and the scent of fallen apples, slowly returning to the earth from which they had sprung, mingled with the crisp, almost sharp perfume of decaying leaves. It was a scent of both an ending and a beginning, a metaphor for the orchard itself, which, once the pride of Eleonora's late uncle, now lay in a state of beautiful, tragic neglect. The farmhouse, a sturdy, weathered sentinel at the edge of the trees, seemed to sag a little, as if weary of holding the memories of a simpler time within its clapboard walls. Eleonora, or Nora, as she had been called in a life she barely remembered, stepped from the hired carriage, her elegant Boston skirts whispering their protest against the damp, uneven ground. The fabric, a deep city blue, was entirely impractical for this rustic world, as were the delicate, uncalloused hands she kept tucked in a small muff. The inheritance, this sprawling tract of land she had never seen, felt more like a burden than a gift, a symbol of a life she had never known and a future she did not want. Boston, with its rigid expectations and stifling drawing rooms, was a cage she understood. This wild, untamed place with its scent of cider and soil was a wilderness she could not comprehend. She had been told there would be a man, a farmhand her uncle had employed, to see to the running of the place. A childhood friend, the lawyer had said, though the memory was a faint, sepia-toned image in the back of her mind. Samuel Cole. The name was as unfamiliar as the landscape. She found him high in the branches of an old gnarled apple tree, its limbs twisted like the arthritic fingers of an ancient crone. He was pruning a dead branch, the rhythmic rasp of his saw the only sound in the still afternoon air. He was a man made of the very earth he tended, broad-shouldered and sun-weathered, his hands, even from this distance, stained with the soil he loved. He did not seem to hear her approach, so intent was he on his task. "Mr. Cole?" she called up, her voice feeling thin and reedy in the vast open space. He stilled his saw, but did not immediately look down. When he did, his eyes, the colour of a stormy sky, were shadowed by a suspicion that bordered on hostility. He took in her elegant attire, the impracticality of her presence, and a muscle worked in his jaw. "Miss Bishop," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be dragged from the very depths of him. It was not a question, but a statement, heavy with unspoken history. I am Eleonora Bishop," she said, feeling a sudden, absurd need to clarify, as if her name, her very identity, was something to be questioned in this place. He offered no reply, merely watched her with that same guarded expression, a mixture of nostalgic affection and deep-seated resentment she could not yet decipher. He feared, she would later learn, that she was just another city dweller, another ephemeral owner who would sell the land without a second thought, without a backward glance at the legacy it held. He swung himself down from the tree with an easy, athletic grace that seemed to mock her own constrained movements. He landed on the balls of his feet, the soft thud of his boots on the damp earth a sound of belonging. Up close he was even more formidable, his presence a solid, unyielding thing. "The lawyer said you'd be arriving," he said, his tone still gruff, challenging. "Yes, he said you would show me the house." He gestured with a jerk of his head towards the weathered farmhouse. "It's not much to look at, not what you're used to in Boston, I'd wager." There was a sharpness in his words, a barb she could not ignore. "I am not here to make comparisons, Mr. Cole. I am here to see what has been left to me." His eyes, those stormy grey eyes, flickered with something she could not name. A memory, perhaps? The ghost of a shared past? "Do you not remember me, Nora?" he asked, the use of her childhood name a sudden, startling intimacy. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, past the broad shoulders and the weathered skin, and saw the boy he had once been, the dark, unruly hair, the intense gaze, the hint of a smile that never quite reached his lips, and with a rush, a memory, as vivid and startling as a flash of lightning, returned to her. "Samuel," she breathed, the name a whisper on the autumn air. "We used to climb this very tree." A flicker of warmth, a spark of connection in the cool, crisp air. It was there for a moment, a bridge across the chasm of a decade. He looked at the tree, then back at her, and for an instant the resentment in his eyes softened, replaced by something akin to longing. "Aye," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not conceal. "We did." But the moment was as fleeting as a firefly in the dusk. The gulf between their present lives, between the Boston heiress and the Orchard's farmhand, was too wide, too deep. The spark was extinguished as quickly as it had been lit, leaving them in the cold, charged silence of unspoken history, of duty and desire, of a past that could never be reclaimed, and a future that was yet to be written. With a resolve that surprised even herself, refused to be a mere spectator in her own inheritance. She would not be the delicate city flower, wilting in the face of honest labour, who would understand this land, this orchard, before she made any decision about its fate. And so, the day after her arrival, she presented herself at the barn, her impractical blue dress replaced by a simple serviceable gown of brown wool, her hands, though still uncalloused, bare and ready for work. Samuel, who was mending a broken fence post, looked up at her approach, his expression a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. "I want to help," she said, her chin held at a determined angle. "I want you to teach me." He said nothing for a long moment, merely studied her, his gaze taking in the change in her attire, the earnestness in her eyes. Then, with a curt nod, he gestured to a pile of fence rails. "The fence along the north pasture needs mending." And so began their unlikely partnership. The days that followed were a blur of shared tasks and slowly unfurling conversations. They mended fences, their hands brushing as they passed nails and hammers. They cleared overgrown branches, the sharp scent of cut wood a constant presence in the air between them. They pressed the last of the season's cider, the sticky sweetness of the apple clinging to their clothes and hair. Their conversations were stilted at first, filled with the awkwardness of two people who had once known each other as children, and now had to navigate the unfamiliar territory of adulthood. But as the days wore on, the silences became less frequent, the words more forthcoming. They spoke of the years they had spent apart, of the lives they had led, of the dreams they had held and the disappointments they had faced. Nora, in a moment of vulnerability, confessed the suffocating loneliness of her life in Boston, the constant pressure of society's expectations, the fear of making the wrong choice, of failing to live up to a legacy she did not understand. Samuel, in turn, spoke of his devotion to her uncle, of his love for the land, of the quiet satisfaction he found in the rhythm of the seasons. In the dim golden light of the barn, with the scent of hay and earth surrounding them, he revealed a vulnerability beneath his rugged exterior, a gentleness that softened the hard edges of his resentment. One evening, as they were herding the pigs into their pen, a mischievous piglet made a dash for freedom, leading them on a clumsy, muddy chase through the orchard. They slipped and slid in the mud, their laughter echoing through the trees, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. When they finally cornered the errant piglet, they were both breathless and covered in mud, their faces flushed, their eyes bright. In that moment, the barriers between them seemed to crumble, replaced by a shared, unguarded mirth. The romantic progression when it came was as natural and as potent as the turning of the seasons. Samuel was teaching her the delicate art of grafting, of joining a new apple variety to an old established rootstock. His hands, calloused and strong, guided hers, his fingers a warm, firm presence on her skin. The touch was electric, a silent acknowledgement of the attraction that had been growing between them, as steady and as sure as the roots of the apple trees themselves. The air grew thick with unspoken feelings, with the scent of apple blossoms and the heat of their proximity. He leaned in, his gaze fixed on her lips, and she felt herself leaning towards him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The world seemed to narrow to the space between their mouths, to the promise of a kiss that would seal the unspoken words that hung in the air between them. But the moment was broken by the distant solemn toll of the church bell, a reminder of the world outside the orchard, of the roles they were meant to play, of the duties that bound them. They drew apart, the spell broken, but the memory of that near kiss, of the electric touch of his hands on hers, lingered, a silent, potent promise of what was yet to come. The arrival of Mr. Alastair Finch from Boston was as jarring as the screech of a train whistle in the tranquil quiet of the orchard. He was a man of the city, slick and polished, his fine wool suit and gleaming leather shoes a stark contrast to the rustic simplicity of the farmhouse. He brought with him the scent of money and ambition, the very things Nora had sought to escape. He was the embodiment of the life she was supposed to want, the life of ease and luxury her inheritance could provide. He had come with an offer, a lucrative one, from a railroad developer who saw not an orchard, but a path for progress, a line of steel and steam that would cut through the heart of the land, connecting the bustling cities of the east. The offer was staggering, a sum that could secure Nora a life of unparalleled comfort and ease, a life free from the burdens of a failing orchard and the hard, unyielding demands of the land. The external conflict was matched by an internal one that raged within Nora's heart. She was torn between her duty to her family's legacy, a legacy she was only just beginning to understand, and the logical, sensible choice to sell. The money would free her, allow her to return to Boston, to the life she knew, the life that was expected of her. But the thought of leaving the orchard, of leaving Samuel, was a sharp physical ache in her chest. Samuel, for his part, watched the proceedings with a growing sense of dread. He saw in Mr. Finch the embodiment of his worst fears, the city slicker who would come and devour the land, leaving nothing but a trail of smoke and progress in his wake. The misunderstanding, when it came, was a cruel twist of fate. Samuel, returning to the farmhouse for a tool, overheard a fragment of a conversation between Nora and the lawyer. He heard her say, "I must consider the offer. Of course, it is a great deal of money." He did not hear the uncertainty in her voice, the tremor of doubt that accompanied the words. He did not see the troubled expression on her face, the conflict that raged in her eyes. He heard only the words, and they were enough to confirm his deepest fears. Believing that she had made her decision, that she had chosen the city and the money over the land and over him, he withdrew completely. The warmth that had begun to blossom between them was extinguished, replaced by a cold, impenetrable wall of politeness. He was courteous, but distant, his words clipped, his gaze averted. He spoke to her only when necessary, his voice devoid of the warmth and intimacy that had begun to colour their interactions. Heartbroken by his sudden distance, and overwhelmed by the weight of her decision, Nora retreated into herself. The sale of the orchard, which had once seemed a distant, abstract possibility, now felt like an inevitable, painful amputation. She saw no other choice, no other path forward. Samuel, believing he had lost everything he held dear, worked himself to the point of exhaustion, his silence a form of self-punishment. He poured his grief and anger into the land, his axe a furious, relentless extension of his pain, as he cleared the deadwood from the orchard, each swing a blow against the cruel, unyielding hand of fate. The orchard, now in the grip of late autumn, seemed to mourn with them, its bare branches stark and skeletal against a grey, unforgiving sky. The scent of decaying apples was no longer one of sweet nostalgia, but of bitter, final decay. The spark that had been lit between them had been extinguished, leaving them in a cold, desolate darkness, each alone with their own private, unspoken grief. The nor'easter rolled in from the coast like a grey, angry beast. its breath a cold, damp wind that rattled the windows of the farmhouse and tore the last of the stubborn leaves from the apple trees. The sky was a bruised, tumultuous canvas of black and purple, the air thick with the scent of rain and the promise of a storm. Nora, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, found Samuel by the woodpile sharpening an axe. The rhythmic thwack of the stone against the steel was a harsh, unforgiving sound, a counterpoint to the rising fury of the wind. She had made her decision, a decision that felt less like a choice and more like a surrender. "I'm selling," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. He did not look up, his hands still moving in their steady, relentless rhythm. "Congratulations," he said, the single word a bitter, poisoned dart, and with that, the dam of their restraint broke. The carefully constructed walls they had built around their hearts crumbled, and a flood of accusations and long-suppressed truths erupted between them. "You never wanted me here," she cried, her voice rising with the wind. "You saw me as an intruder, a city girl who would never understand." "And what did you expect?" he shot back, his eyes, when he finally looked at her, blazing with a cold, righteous anger. "You came here in your fine clothes with your city ways, and you looked at this place as if it were a curiosity, a chapter in a book you could close and put away when you were done. That's not true, isn't it? You were ready to sell from the moment you arrived. You saw only the neglect, the decay. You didn't see the heart of this place, the soul of it. You didn't see what it could be." "And you," she retorted, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and pain, "you saw only what you wanted to see. You saw a spoiled heiress who would sell her birthright for a life of ease. You didn't see that I was afraid of failing, of not being enough, of not being worthy of this place." The argument followed them into the barn, the wind and rain lashing at the old wood, the scent of hay and damp earth a thick, cloying presence in the air. In a moment of raw, unvarnished honesty, his voice cracking with an emotion he could no longer contain, Samuel confessed the truth that had been buried beneath his anger and resentment. "It's not just the orchard," he said, his voice a low, ragged whisper. "It's not just the land I can't bear to lose. It's you, Nora. It's you." Of course. Here is a more detailed and passionate version of the love scene from Part 4, crafted to be more erotic and romantic, drawing upon the requested inspirations. His confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, trembling thing, broken by a sudden, violent clap of thunder that shook the old barn to its foundations. And in that moment, the storm outside was mirrored by the tempest within. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands finding her face, his calloused thumbs stroking the tears from her cheeks with a reverence that undid her completely. The scent of rain and wet earth clung to him, a wild, primal smell that filled her senses. Their kiss was a desperate, hungry thing, a collision of 2 souls who had been starving for a connection they had been too proud, too afraid to admit they craved. It was not gentle. It was a raw, bruising claiming, his mouth taking hers with all the pent-up frustration and longing of the past weeks. She answered with equal fire, her hands tangling in his damp hair, pulling him closer, her body arching against his. It was a kiss of anger and forgiveness, of grief and fierce, unbridled joy. The taste of him was rain and salt and a deep, earthy sweetness that was purely Samuel. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his mouth never leaving hers, and carried her towards the ladder, to the loft. The ascent was a dizzying blur, a tangle of limbs and desperate kisses, the drumming of the rain on the tin roof, a frantic heartbeat accompanying their own. In the loft, the air was thick with the sweet, dry scent of hay, a soft, golden world suspended above the storm's fury. He laid her down on a pile of soft, yielding hay, and for a moment They simply looked at each other, their breath coming in ragged gasps. In the dim light filtering through the hayloft window, his eyes burned with an intensity that stripped her bare, seeing past the Boston heiress, past the frightened girl, to the very core of the woman she was. "Nora," he breathed, the name a prayer. The anger was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective tenderness. His hands, those large, capable hands that knew the language of the earth, began to explore the landscape of her body with a slow, deliberate wonder. He fumbled with the tiny buttons of her woolen dress, his fingers, accustomed to the heft of an axe handle, clumsy against the delicate fabric. The sound of the cloth tearing slightly was a sharp, thrilling sound in the quiet loft. She didn't care. She helped him, her own fingers trembling as she worked at the laces of her corset. A garment that suddenly felt like a cage, a relic from another life. One by one the layers of her old life fell away, the dress, the petticoats, the corset, until she lay before him in the soft light, clad only in her thin chemise, her skin luminous against the dark gold of the hay. He looked at her, his gaze a slow, burning caress, and she saw not judgment, but worship in his eyes. He stripped off his own rough work shirt, revealing a torso sculpted by labour, his skin sun-bronzed and taut over hard muscle. He was beautiful, a man made of the very land she was learning to love. He came to her then, his body covering hers, the heat of his skin a shocking, delicious contrast to the cool air of the loft. His calloused hands traced the curve of her waist, the swell of her hip, the delicate line of her collarbone as if memorizing her by touch alone. He kissed her again, a slow deep kiss that spoke of a reverence for the flesh, a sacred communion of bodies and souls. His mouth moved from her lips to her throat, his tongue tracing a trail of fire down to the hollow between her breasts. She gasped, her back arching, her hands clutching at his shoulders. It was a surrender more complete, more profound than any she had ever known, a willing, eager giving of herself to this man, this storm. He moved lower, his lips and hands exploring every inch of her, awakening sensations she had never known, a deep molten heat coiling in the pit of her stomach, the scratch of the hay against her bare skin, the drumming of the rain on the roof, the sound of his ragged breathing, her own soft cries. It all merged into a symphony of the senses, a raw elemental music that stripped away all thought, all fear. He closed the last distance between them, a slow, deliberate motion that was both an act of worship and a desperate need. A soft breath escaped her as she met his gaze, her eyes wide and dark. In that moment, as their worlds merged into one, a silent vow passed between them. She met his gaze, her own eyes wide and dark, and in that moment, a silent vow passed between them. She wrapped her legs around his waist, drawing him deeper, her body accepting him, welcoming him home. Their rhythm was the rhythm of the storm, at first slow and gentle, then building in intensity, a fierce, driving cadence that echoed the wind and the rain. It was a raw, primal act of possession, a dance of two bodies moving as one, their mingled sweat a heady, intoxicating perfume. It was a physical release, but it was also an emotional transcendence, a sealing of their bond in the most intimate way imaginable. The climax, when it came, was a shattering, all-consuming wave that broke over them both, a moment of pure, blinding light that burned away all the anger, all the pain, all the misunderstanding, leaving in its wake only the pure, unadulterated truth of their love. In the aftermath, as the storm outside began to subside, they lay tangled in each other's arms, their bodies cooling, their heartbeats slowing in unison. The scent of hay and rain and their own sated flesh was a comforting, intimate perfume. He stroked her hair, his touch gentle now, his eyes full of a love so profound it stole her breath. In the quiet, spent aftermath of their passion, a new understanding dawned, a deep physical knowledge they now shared. Vulnerability was not a weakness, but a strength. Nora understood that her strength lay not in escaping her responsibility, but in embracing it. And Samuel learned that love required the risk of being hurt, the courage to open your heart to the possibility of both joy and pain. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake a clean, rain-washed world, a world of new beginnings, of hope, of a love that had been forged and finally consummated in the fire of their own private tempest. In the clear, crisp light of the morning after the storm, Nora, with a sense of clarity and purpose she had never known, tore the developer's contract into 100 tiny pieces, the fluttering white scraps a symbol of her newfound resolve. She would not sell. She would not run. She would stay. She used a portion of her inheritance not to return to Boston, but to breathe new life into the orchard. New saplings were ordered, modern equipment was purchased, and a sense of hope, as fresh and as potent as the scent of the rain-washed earth, began to permeate the old farmhouse. She and Samuel became partners in every sense of the word, their days filled with the shared labour of restoring the orchard to its former glory, their nights with the quiet intimacy of two people who had found in each other a home they had never known, their love, born in the ashes of a shared unspoken grief, was rooted in the very soil they were fighting to save. The final scene of their story unfolded not in the golden haze of autumn, but in the tender, hopeful light of spring. The orchard was a riot of pink and white blossoms, the air alive with the buzz of bees and the sweet, intoxicating perfume of new life. They were planting the first of the new trees together, their hands meeting in the rich, dark earth as they settled the sapling into its new home. The soil was cool and damp against their skin, a tangible connection to the land, to the future they were building together. Samuel turned to her, his eyes, the colour of a spring sky after a storm, full of a quiet, unwavering devotion. He said nothing, for no words were needed. He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, lingering kiss that tasted of sunshine and apple blossoms and the promise of a future that would grow, season after season, alongside the orchard they had saved, the love they had found. It was a vow of love and renewal, a promise of a life that would be as enduring, as beautiful as the land itself.